Okay, so today we're going to be talking about revision for the strategic brand management exam, but also reviewing some of the topics that we've covered in the module. But you should definitely use this session to think about specific areas that you're going to revise for the exam, as we've kind of covered in the revision seminars as well. But use this set of slides, the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this screencast, to think about the specific areas, the papers that you'll read, and where you might focus your revision. Okay, so you'll remember right at the start of the module, obviously it was Nigel then that was doing the lectures, but he will very much have spoken to you about the two different perspectives, and we've also covered this in the revision seminar. So we've talked in some great detail about there being kind of not lots of disagreement about what a brand is, but certainly some contrasting perspectives that we can look at a brand from. So firstly, thinking about what a brand is from a management perspective, it's perceived to be something that can help develop important strategic elements such as developing sustainable competitive advantage. So you can see here in the American Marketing Association's quote that it's talking about differentiation. So obviously we want to put as generic strategies. So this idea that it gives us the ability to differentiate what we're selling from our competitors. And I guess at a really basic level, that's really about identity and identifying our brand versus another, and allowing customers to identify what belongs to our organisation, which products, versus competitors. But it's also about a symbol and a sign to them of something. So the likelihood is that this is where it starts to overlap with the customer perspective, because I think even from an organisational perspective, we recognise that it represents something, a promise to deliver something to a customer. So just beyond a signifier and an identifier, it recommends it recognises something beyond that kind of really intangible element to a brand. From a customer perspective, we can talk about it being a collection of perceptions. So Susan Fournier, who writes a lot about brand relationships, talks about it being these perceptions that are held in the mind of the consumer, which is very much linked into positioning when you really think about it. But it's the idea that it means something to a consumer, and Grant McCracken's got a really nice way of articulating this by saying that a brand is a cluster of meanings. So this idea that it's this collection of perceptions, it's this collection of ideas, and when a customer sees a brand, it evokes those ideas and it evokes that meaning, and linking into a management perspective, that's potentially what differentiates it from other brands that they might choose. So building on this, and we have talked about this quite a lot, haven't we, over the last couple of weeks when we've looked at things like luxury brands. But if we look at it on different levels, we can think about brands having several different roles. So at a functional level, it's where it really sort of links into that basic idea that it identifies one group of products or service from another. So it's simply about being able to identify what belongs to what organisation, and that's much more kind of rational and functionally based. If we think about the brand doing something for us, it helps us make those identifications. A relational level, it can have a role in helping a customer make a relationship with an organisation. So we talk a lot about relationship marketing, and brands can be real conduits, real catalysts to enable us to actually form those relationships. So Susan Fournier's work talks a lot about how we make relationships, or we form relationships with brands in the same way we would humans. And she talks about us being married to a brand, or even being divorced if we've fallen out with a brand. We might have some brands that are casual relationships, so those that we infrequently purchase, and we might have others that where we're much more committed. And equally, we might have secret affairs with brands that we don't particularly want to consume in public, and perhaps don't even want to confess to ourselves or admit to ourselves that we want to consume this brand and we're fond of it. But there are several different relationships we might have, and a brand can act as a conduit to help those relationships form. Now, symbolically, and again, we've talked quite a bit about this, it's the idea that consumers can buy brands, can consume brands to convey who they are to others. So it helps them symbolically influence what other people think of them. And certainly like Roper and Shaw and Elliot and Leonard have done work, particularly with children and young people, where they've examined this idea and explored the notion that we use brands to evaluate others. So not only are we using them to influence what other people think of us, but knowing that people will think something about us, perhaps based on the brands that we wear, we actively seek out brands that we think are representative of that identity we want to project. But equally, we might see someone on the other side and use the brands that they're wearing to evaluate them. And sometimes this can be a little bit problematic, because some of the researchers found that children start to judge one another and think that if you don't wear expensive brands or you don't wear any brands, then that's a representative of who you are as a person, which can be a little bit problematic, because obviously we don't want to, perhaps as a society, be feeling that we judge each other based on what we own rather than who we are as individuals. However, brands do have a role as a symbol, and are an integral part of what we call symbolic consumption. So importantly, recognising that brands have a number of different roles for consumers, as they do organisations. This idea already that Grant McCracken proposes, which is that brands are a cluster of meanings. So how do we create that meaning? Well, the brand, this is an argument that the brand transmits that meaning probably through advertising, social media, celebrity endorsements to the consumer. The consumer takes that meaning on board, and then they interpret what the brand's saying to them. And I guess at that point they will decide whether symbolically this is a brand whether they want to connect with or not. Remembering that brand meaning is really important, but it equally is subjective, and you can be perceived one way amongst one set of consumers and another amongst others. So managing that can be a little bit problematic, but we'd recognise that there are a number of really strong brands where if we were asked to articulate what they meant to us, we would probably come out with quite similar concepts around what we thought the ideology behind that brand was. So this is important for brands to consider in terms of what kinds of meaning do they want their consumers to derive from ownership of the brand. Phil argues that brand meaning that we just talked about is very much derived from communication, as I've already said. So whether that's advertising, social media, sponsorship, whatever it might be. But we make a promise to our consumers when we communicate with them. So we're managing their expectations, we're telling them what they can get from the brand performance, and equally that ties in with positioning. So as we said already, when we looked at Fournier's definition of what a brand is, this perception, that's very much what positioning is about. So there's a really close relationship between these three P's: the promise we make to consumers, and therefore what their likely expectations are going to be, the positioning, but equally the performance. So that performance needs to be very much consistent with the position and the brand promise, and they're not, one doesn't influence the other. Communication has a really important role here, right at the centre, but they all sort of collectively influence one another. So brand performance is kind of like what our real experience is as a consumer when we interact with that brand, and clearly depending on that interaction will determine perhaps some of the perceptions that we hold, as well as our kind of evaluation as to whether they delivered on brand promise. So an area where many academics agree is the idea that the brand is made up of these different elements. David Ogilvy would say that it's a complex symbol made up of like name, packaging, but there are very visual elements like the logo, There are more kind of even audio elements like a jingle. So you can probably think of some brands that have really memorable jingles and would evoke the brand. So these are all different elements that evoke and make us think about the brand. Brands themselves being so symbolic that the visual parts are particularly important because they are what signifies that brand meaning and what evokes the brand meaning in our consumers. As you've already probably covered in other modules in second year and perhaps even earlier, positioning is about obviously working out who your target market is, and in a really ideal scenario you'd want that kind of one group of customers who you're targeting, so you can really tie in what the brand means to what they're interested in. Obviously the more target audiences you have, the more complex that becomes, and you start to enter into an area where you might be diluting your impact by representing different meanings to several different groups of customers. So in the process of positioning our brand, we think about who our target audience is, and we need to gather some really deep insights into who they are and what they're interested in. A little bit developing profiling and pen pictures. We might want to identify who our competitors are to establish whether there's a gap in the market. And then we are likely to determine the most important attributes to the consumer, as I already said. So we need to think about what is it that our customers are interested in, because what we want to do is make sure that when they're looking at that particular solution that they're interested in, that product, that they are the factors that they place a lot of importance on is what's associated with our brand. We might want to think about how our competitors are perceived, because ultimately positioning is relative to the competitors that we are competing with, and on the back of that information, we assess our best positioning strategy and work out how it is we want to be perceived, and then work on using communications and other elements of our marketing mix to develop and maintain that brand position. Now, obviously, we need to evaluate that position over a period of time to check that our perceptions, for whatever reason it might be, haven't changed. Perhaps competitors have eroded elements of our alignment with important attributes. So this is something we need to stay on top of. It's not something that once we establish we can think, well, that's a job done and we move on. We constantly have to be revisiting it. Obviously target audience needs and wants change and evolve, and we have to keep pace with that, and ensure that we are keeping up with their evolving demands. Okay, so as we know, the brand concept, Lafayette would argue, is made up of these different elements. So identity, so our kind of strategic goal as an organisation, as a brand, how we want to be perceived. The image, so that what that perception is, and then the linking with positioning, so how positioning helps us derive that perception, and how that all leads to equity. So that the idea that because we have a brand, we have some value attached to that brand, and it's more than what just the product is. So you remember that quite early in the module, I think it was perhaps the first or second seminar, we asked you to read the No Logo chapter, which is on the Blackboard site, Naomi Klein's work on anti-globalisation, so to consider some of the roles of brands in society, and that kind of resistance and anti-globalisation we've had in terms of brand. So as part of your revision, it's important that you go back and have a look at that and make sure that you are fully aware of the issues that Klein raises in her book and that particular chapter, where we looked at Marlborough Friday and some of the idea behind brands and the fact that they are, are we encouraging consumers to buy things that they don't really need, and we're creating needs that don't exist, and is that problematic? Also, go back and look at some of the work we looked at on teenagers. So some of the articles that we consider, I think we looked at Santini and Mailer and their work around symbolic consumption in teenagers. And again, this idea that we're not buying brands because of their functional uses, because we want them to do something for us, but what they mean to us, and potentially does that mean we really need them, or are we just creating these kind of unsustainable consumption related desires? brands have a really fundamental role in the notion of consumption, because they are a big part of our everyday consumer behaviour, and the things that we buy are very much driven by brands. I mean, we've talked quite a lot about this idea of, when is something functional, when is it purely symbolic, and actually most consumption activities we participate in are probably a sliding scale of the two. So some things that we buy are going to be purely symbolic, and we might really sort of struggle to justify on a very rational, functional level. And there are going to be other things that we buy that are functional, that we only buy for the things that they do for us. But actually, when you think about it, most purchases, most brand related purchases are going to be a real combination and mixture of the two. And there might be some kind of really symbolic element, and there might be kind of some really functional elements too. So if you go to buy a new coat, so you might think, I want a coat that's waterproof, I want it to keep me warm and be comfortable. And there might be a number of different coats that you could buy, but then you start to think about the brand, and there might be certain brands you think, well, I don't want to associate with that brand doesn't represent who I think I am symbolically, so I'm not going to connect with that brand. So you can see there that there's both functional elements to the purchase, but equally the symbolic elements too, and the kind of real sort of interwoven element of that is those combinations of different needs that we have in every sort of consumption situation. Okay, so continuing on the idea of consumption, there are obviously, as I've sort of already mentioned, a few societal issues that we might want to think about. So one of the arguments around consumption, one of the criticisms that's levied at marketing, I guess, and consumption is this the idea of materialism. And whilst, you could make some arguments for the positive aspects of materialism, sort of making us feel good about ourselves and it being a positive and pleasant experience, going shopping and buying stuff, there's lots of research that tells us that the actual buzz of materialism that we get as consumers is pretty short-lived. And then what happens when we sort of come out of the buzz of materialism is that can make us feel pretty low again as individuals. So and Belk's research, Belk's written a paper called Trait Aspects of Materialism, where he looks at the he's essentially trying to research whether materialism is a good or bad thing, and the kind of traits that it elicits in individuals and consumers. And he comes to the conclusion eventually that actually it's negative. So that materialism facilitates negative traits within us, such as greed and envy. It's well worth having a look at that paper. It's on the if it's not on the Blackboard site already, I'll sort of check it out in the next few days and put it on there. Okay. We looked at in some of the early seminars, we looked at this notion of commodification of self-esteem, which is this idea that we buy brands, particularly people who have low self-esteem, and specifically teenagers and adolescents who experience a dip in self-esteem as they enter into their formative kind of teenage years, but where they're stuck between being a child and an adult and they're trying to work out who they are. And Isaacson and Roper have conducted quite a bit of research and written a few different papers on this idea that actually what brands are doing is buying and selling self-esteem. So teenagers feel low about themselves, they've got low self-esteem, not all teenagers, but some. And what they try to do is populate that gap with brands that make them feel good about themselves and make them feel that they are more complete in terms of their self-concept, and make them feel socially accepted, so they fit in because they're wearing the right brands. And as we said earlier, consumers and particularly children are using signifiers such as brands to evaluate each other, and then they use that to populate that missing bit of self-esteem that they're experiencing. So clearly that can be problematic, because linking into the short-lived nature of materialism, what happens when you can't afford to buy those brands? Where does it leave those consumers that don't have the resources, and Isaacson and Roper call this the vicious cycle, because you're in this, you're caught in this cycle where you want to own the best, the sort of right brands, if you like, because that's quite important that they're the right ones, to be socially accepted and to get positive evaluations from others, make positive impressions, but you can't afford to buy them. So where does that leave you? Perhaps not in a very good place. So that leads us quite nicely on to the next point, which is this acquisitive criminal behaviour. So there was a report, a white paper that was written, so a bit of research that was conducted into the 2011 riots that occurred in the UK, in quite a few cities across the UK over summer of 2011. And what this report was looking at is kind of some of the causes, so some of the problems that might have caused people to behave the way they did. And there's a whole section in that report that's based around brands and advertising, and it's looking at this whole notion of many of the points that we're looking at on this slide. So, does this kind of creating of like really aspirational and desirable brands, does this mean that when people can't afford them, it leads them to criminal behaviour? I mean, more than half of the crime that was committed during the riots was acquisitive in nature, so it was about acquiring goods, and most of that was aimed at luxury brands. So liquor brands that potentially some of these people might not be able to afford to own. So, again, does it present us with issues? There's clearly linked into that is this deepening gap in wealth. So the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and so again, if consumers feel like they need to own brands, and not just luxury brands, but like we've seen with Kathy Hamilton's work, this idea that even privately consumed fast-moving consumer goods can have brands that are important to consumers and make them feel like perhaps they're giving their children the best chances in life by owning those brands. And where does it leave people if they can't afford them? So it is problematic, and it's something as brand managers of the future that you guys need to be aware of, and again, some kind of stuff to sort of revise and think about for your exam preparation. Kind of building on that in many ways is the idea of corporate social responsibility. So again, thinking about ethics is why do brands engage with corporate social responsibility? Remembering that we've got these kind of two kind of methods, if you like, of engaging with corporate social responsibility. That kind of strategic, where it's very much embedded in your day-to-day business. So businesses like People Tree or Divine Chocolate, who are kind of social enterprises really, and are there to fund a cause rather than make a profit. So it's not that their primary objective is making a profit, and actually they've added something on that's ethical. Whereas a lot of organisations are responsive. So it's not a strategic part of who they are. It's not their source of sustainable competitive advantage. And it is driven by perhaps other factors, such as customers who might want they might feel that customers will only buy brands that are engaging with corporate social responsibility causes like Fair Trade, Rainforest Alliance, this kind of stuff. So there's an element that might be about moral obligation, so they might feel morally that they are obliged as a part of a society and a business that's making money from that society to engage with CSR activity. There might be an element of sustainability. I mean, that Porter and Kramer tell us that the corporate social responsibility and profit are not mutually exclusive. So, this is not about adding something on that's going to cost us money, because at the end of the day, if we engage in many corporate social corporately responsible activities, just thinking about our impact on the environment, one of the things we'll find is that saves us money too. So if we decide we're going to use less paper as a university, that's good for the environment, and it also presents us with cost efficiencies. In some places, it may be a license to operate. So it might be that you have to be fair trade. It may be that you have to source your wood from a sustainable supply if you're going to then supply B&Q, or you have to be a sustainable supplier. So in some industries, it is a license to operate, and others are going to do it for brand and reputation purposes. So it's about having a positive and a good reputation, being trustworthy as an organisation. But again, thinking about whether that is reactively driven, so it's a response to drivers like market drivers, competitors are doing it, or customers, and thinking about whether it's driven by a true sort of desire to contribute something back to the society that all businesses are a part of. So you need to know sort of some stuff around corporate social responsibility, responsive or strategic, and what that actually means. And remember, is the ultimate question for what most customers are going to ask of a business is corporate social responsibility about adding extra stuff on and doing more good, or is it about thinking about your day-to-day business operations and actually just doing less harm in the things that you're doing every day? Things that we can be doing do contribute, such as CSR, to things like brand equity. So when we talk about brand equity, what do we mean? Now, this knowing about brand equity for the exam is useful because we know we're going to get that broad-based question, and this is, the key premise around brands, isn't it? So it's the idea that the brand gives something extra beyond the kind of functional core product. So it's made up of many parts, but it's the fundamental notion that a brand provides some level or something extra. Whether it's positively or negatively, it provides something else, and it's based on consumer perceptions. And the guy that owned Quaker Oats would always say, you take the physical assets of our organisation, so you can take the fixed assets like the factories, the manufacturing equipment, and I'll take the brands, and I'll be the richer man, because he recognised that even though you're taking away something intangible that doesn't exist physically, the whole kind of meaning that's generated around a brand and the identity and the image means something to a customer, and it influences customers ultimately over which specific products or services they engage with. So in that sense, it adds value to an organisation. So we've got a few different definitions here, and then we've subsequently got different models that we can use. And you will be familiar with some of these because I know that you've covered them in your assignment. Some of these authors do a really good job of providing us with models that break down the notion of brand equity, and I would make sure for the exam that you are familiar with those models. And you can do that visually as well as sort of just theoretically knowing the theory. Be familiar with what it looks like, because that's a different way of learning, and that's important. Okay. So Acres model pretty much tells us that brand equity is made up of these 4 component parts. So brand loyalty, so the fact that customers are loyal to us and will choose our brand over other brands and keep coming back. And there are many benefits to having loyal customers. They're more forgiving if you make a mistake. They'll promote you to others. They're less price sensitive. So having that loyal group of customers that you have a relationship that your brand really resonates with, who you can rely on, is really important and contributes something. And as we said earlier, having the brand as a conduit, that is really important. The fact that customers know about you, so awareness is important. If you are not aware of a brand, that brand is never going to make it into your consideration and ultimately choice and purchase set. So there's going to be a total set of brands that are out there, but we will only be aware of some of them in any given situation. So being and having a high level of awareness obviously again contributes something. Perceived quality, so the notion that the brand tells the customer something about what they're likely to receive from consumption of that brand, and there's a perception there, again contribute something to the brand equity. And then there are kind of our associations and other proprietary assets that add to that brand. So the name, the slogan, the symbol, they all add equity to our brand. As I've already said, there's a number of different models that break down and likewise build back up the idea of brand equity. So I would make sure that you are familiar with these. The Keller customer-based brand equity is a good one for the exam. So make sure you've revised them and that you can explain and reiterate them, learn them, and then perhaps when you come back after Christmas and you're back with your colleagues on the module, perhaps teach each other these models, so explain them to each other, because that's a really good way of helping you retain that information. You will need to know some stuff about reputation for the exam, so make sure you revise areas of reputation. This is a great model from Von Broom that's really good, handy for you to know, just if you want to explain what a good reputation is made up of. So he essentially makes this argument that corporate reputation is made up of our reliability, so how reliable we are considered as an organisation. Are we perceived to deliver on the things that we say we're going to deliver, how credible we are, so how believable are the things that we say and the arguments that we make as an organisation, the promises that we make. Do we believe that's a credible proposition? How trustworthy we are. So do we trust this organisation? Is this an organisation that would always look after us? Is this a brand that wouldn't rip us off, as it were? And so can we trust them? And how responsible we are. So do we take consideration of other members of society and our employees and other stakeholders? So remember, when we think about reputation, we don't just think about consumers. So it is possible to have a good, a strong brand and not a great reputation. If we look at a comparator of top 10 reputable companies versus top 10 brands, there are quite a few significant differences. I mean, Google appears on both, so that's kind of one that makes a strong argument for having a good reputation. But look at an organisation like Ryanair, well known for having a poor reputation, but yet certainly at one point in time the most profitable airline in Europe. So is it possible to be effective, profitable, be a successful brand and have a poor reputation? So make sure, as well as knowing what a good reputation looks like, equally you have some kind of counter arguments to enable you to present some critical arguments. Just think about what if you want to break down what corporate reputation is made up of, we've got that corporate personality. So if this organisation was a person, what would they be like? We've got our identity or brand, however we want to talk about that. We've got our image. So how do we perceive them? And that all contributes to our overall, some of our corporate reputation. So the way we would think about an organisation, and these elements will tell us whether we believe them to be consistent with the factors that Von Broom argues make a good reputation. So trustworthiness, the credibility, the responsibility, all of that all derives from these different areas. Book on corporate reputation, Roper and Phil make some really valid arguments around the relationship between what goes on within an organisation, so that kind of culture, the values and the employees, and creating a strong brand. So they're making that connection between that internal culture and the way that an organisation behaves, looks after its staff, recruits and retains the most talented staff, and the contribution that then makes to having a really powerful and brand that resonates with its target audience. But that's cyclical. So the stronger the brand, it reinforces the values, which in turn reinforces the culture, which means we retain the best staff. And so it's that really virtuous circle that keeps reinforcing one another. So it's important that we recognise the relevance and the contribution that internal culture and the people that we employ, particularly in a service context, contribution that makes to having a really strong and powerful brand that our consumers want to connect with. So make sure you're aware of this as well. Remembering that in terms of corporate culture, it's that real iceberg metaphor. So this idea that above the surface are all those kinds of slogans, the physical settings, the behaviour, the way the organisation conducts itself, all that stuff that's essentially observable and we can see. But there's so much more that goes on that underpins that corporate culture. So all the assumptions that we make, those beliefs, the values, the way that the organisations do things internally, and how they're likely to react to certain situations. So all of that does contribute to creating a strong brand, as we've seen on the last slide. But it's kind of remembering that there's all that implicit stuff that's beneath the surface that's probably just as, if not more important than the stuff that the consumer can observe. Roos and Lindbergh have this brand communications triangle argument that they make, that what the firm does, so that delivery and service touch point, is kind of the most important in terms of what happens. So what the firm say. So those planned messages are not as important as the things that people say about them, the endorsements. But what's the most important is the experience that we have. So the way that we behave. So those touch points that we have in terms of performance. So what we experience as individuals is going to resonate with us the most and send the strongest messages. Advertising, we're pretty savvy, so we can work out. So that planned messaging doesn't resonate. It acts to reinforce, but it doesn't necessarily make a stronger connection as what we experience for ourselves.